Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. I'm your host, Elif Sarican, and today I have the absolute pleasure of being joined by Nadine Maenza. Thank you for joining us today, Nadine.
Thanks for having me.
So, on the 10th of February, the US House Foreign Affairs Committee held a hearing titled Syria at a Crossroads, US Policy Challenges Post-Assad. And this was in the context of a act called Save the Kurds that was introduced by Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal. Nadine, as co-chair of the International Religious Freedom Roundtable and former chair of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, during your testimony, you emphasized that religious and ethnic minorities in Syria do not want special treatment. So the Christians, Druze, Alawites, and Kurds, they just want to be equal citizens in
Mhm.
peace and democracy, something that did not exist under Assad for decades, but also sadly, seemingly still doesn't exist and doesn't seem very promising in terms of the future prospects. For example, Syria is still called formally the Syrian Arab Republic, with laws stating only a Muslim can become president, amongst other legislations that effectively creates second-class citizenship. How can genuine equality be achieved when the constitutional framework itself excludes both non-Arabs and non-Muslim citizens in a country that many describe very beautifully actually as a mosaic?
Yeah, so it was disappointing to see how quickly they introduced the interim constitution and that it was so flawed with things like you mentioned, the Arab Republic name, the president having to be Muslim, but not having to be Syrian, but having to be Muslim. And of course, the laws being under Islamic jurisprudence, which really favors obviously the Muslim community. And it doesn't have to have laws like that. For instance, Turkey had that same sort of law and then ended up becoming a secular constitution. And no one would say that Turkey disrespects Muslims. So you could have a constitution that gives equal ground for all the religious and ethnic communities and still not offend any communities. And so I think that I was so stunned when I met with religious minority communities after the overthrow of Assad. And I think that, they first of all were all thrilled that Assad was gone. And Assad claimed to favor the minorities. He claimed to favor the Alawites, the Christians. But if you looked at those communities, most of them lived in severe poverty. And it was really only that 1% of those communities that benefited in the sense that they became wealthy and that they really were that close to Assad. So most of these communities lived in poverty, but they maybe weren't targeted quite the same as the Sunnis were with chemical weapons and things like that. So we just see these horrific attacks. So many, like the Druze in Jeremiah, for instance, they hit a lot of the Sunnis that were targeted by Assad. So, I mean, what they want is just to live equally with their neighbors of other religious communities, including the Sunnis, who they live for thousands of years together peacefully, and they want an environment that invites that. And to have, like you said, the Constitution marginalizing voices by making everyone feel like a second-class citizen, and it does signal to people, even children as they're growing up, that they are more privileged or the other groups are second-class citizens, and that doesn't build the kind of social cohesion that Syria needs to recover from the years of Assad family rule.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of the example of Turkey, you've also warned that President Erdogan is seeking to restore a some sort of Ottoman Empire, or what some people also call a neo-Ottomanism, all the way to Jerusalem and beyond. Given Erdogan's close connection to Syria's current interim president Ahmed al-Sharaa, also its known role in both the th overthrow of Assad in 2024 and also in terms of who also replaced Assad, even credited in somewhat a semi-comical way by Trump, saying, he won't accept it, but he did it when he spoke about
Mhm.
Erdogan. To achieve this, we're also seeing, or it seems to achieve this, we're also seeing the consolidation of an quite an exclusionary state model rather than a movement towards inclusion. Does Erdogan need Syria to be quite an exclusionary, hyper-centralized state to realize some of his regional ambitions?
Well, when you look at the areas that Turkey invaded and occupies in northeast Syria, Afrin, Serikani, Razalain, you look at the areas that he's now has the Syrian National Army overseeing these areas, and we see just horrific conditions for everybody, but especially religious and ethnic minorities, with all sorts of land has been taken away from them, and we've had all sorts of religious sites destroyed. Especially Yazidis have probably been targeted the most. And I think I quoted the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedoms reports on the horrific conditions in these areas. And so Erdogan in Syria doesn't have the constitutional constraints that he has in Turkey. So in these areas, they're far worse than they are in the places in Turkey because of the constitution doesn't allow him to do those things. And I think when he looks at Syria, he has an opportunity, first of all, to build this country into being more in line with maybe his values than even Turkey would be. And of course, we're seeing him arm the country. He's setting up bases everywhere, logistical support, training the officers. And yeah, he's said publicly many times that he wanted to rebuild the Ottoman Empire. I don't know if he's doing that just to rally the troops or what the goal is there, but clearly we've seen that kind of language being used. So I think it's something that the international community needs to be watching, monitoring, and I think that he needs to pull the Syrian National Army out of the areas in the northern Syria and allow the Syrian government to run those rather than the Syrian National Army, because it's odd that they would take the northeast and want that, but yet allow the Turkey to continue to run these areas.
Yeah, and as we know, before the now interim president al-Sharaa took Damascus, the area his force, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, so HTS, controlled in Idlib, actually used the Turkish lira as a currency,
Right.
as some would know. So I think there's an interesting connection there, for sure. And one of the things you also have spoken about is some of your conversations with those who are part of minority communities on the ground in Syria. In the last few weeks, so in early 2026, there was some, what some have called very promising and some have called lip service announcements by the interim president, where the Kurdish language, long, criminalized in Syria and in other parts of the region, would be considered a national language. So some people really welcome that, but also some people said that national language, it does not mean an official language, and the key difference there. How do minorities on the ground view these constitutional limitations versus the rhetoric about, inclusion and some of the practices of exclusion?
Yeah, I was told that Article 13 announcement, while it was welcomed by the Kurdish community, that it would really only mean a couple of hours of Kurdish language a week, where they would love to see Kurdish communities have the opportunity to have their education be in Kurdish. So there's still a huge gap between what would be considered equal and that decree, but nevertheless, we will. I'm glad to sing the praises for any positive movement towards inclusion that comes from the Syrian government, because I want to see them succeed. That, my testimony was not in any way to try to take them down, but actually to provide cover to make the kind of changes they need to be able to be successful. And building an inclusive government, their entire base doesn't want that. There are a lot putting pressure on the president to not build an inclusive government. And I think it's important the international community counter that and push for an inclusive government, because that's the only way they're going to be successful. And ultimately, that I think is what the one thing we all have in common, even if we're looking at the country differently, is how can we help this country to be successful so the people can recover from just decades of horrific conditions.
Yeah, and as you and many others who have really followed both the very horrible, bloody war in Syria for over a decade, and also, in the lead up to it as well, have also said that essentially an exclusionary Syria means a recipe to recreate what has been seen, particularly in the last decade, but also what led to that. You've also traveled extensively both to Syria and Iraq, understanding conditions on the ground for religious minorities as well. You spoke about the Yazidis. You've worked extensively on both genocide prevention and also, work with genocide survivors, particularly regarding to atrocities committed by the so-called Islamic State against the Yazidi people, with reports of ISIS prisoners being freed from camps that have fallen under Syrian government control, whether that's deliberate or due to a vacuum. How do you assess the current ISIS threat?
I understand that at least 200 ISIS fighters escaped, and that was part of the urgency of moving all of these prisoners into Iraq, out of Syria so that they wouldn't have the opportunity to escape under the Syrian government. So I think that showed that there was some fear that these forces would actually free that these dangerous, hardened Islamist fighters. I also, have visited Al Hol camp numerous times. I was first there, I think it was 70,000 people, and then it ended up, coming down into the 30,000s. Well, it's empty now. And when I was there before, I heard about how they stoned people. They committed horrific atrocities against people in the camp that weren't espousing their ideology. So this is an extremely dangerous group of people, the family members of ISIS. And I've talked to people who've resettled them in different countries and how hardened they were and how hard it was to work with them through that process and how to try to change their ideology and how so many of them were very well educated. It wasn't that these were women that were tricked into marrying an ISIS fighter. These were people that made that choice because they believed it deeply. So you figure they've emptied that camp out. They're now free, and it's stunning to think what that could mean for those Yazidi communities, those who had been targeted by this very group before, and also the fact that there's still almost 2,700 Yazidi women and girls and children still missing. And every quarter it seems like they were finding a Yazidi in Al Hol camp, at least recently. And so we have to wonder. If there were Yazidis still with these families that are traveling and still not able to get free. So I think the international community needs to put more focus on finding these women and children. And also, it's important that the Yazidi community in particular is allowed to be a part of their own security and their own governance, which I think they will be in the Northeast if this deal is implemented fairly. That would keep some of the Syrian security forces that have that Islamist ideology out of their areas, which will be really important for their own protection.
Yeah, and I mean, as you've said, when we talk about Yazidi women and children, many of quite possibly many of those who are still undocumented for or unaccounted for,
Yeah,
who are women, would have been children when they were first kidnapped.
yeah,
So, when we talk about this, of course, beyond the work of accounting for the, hundreds of Yazidi, particularly women and children that have been missing, but people who have been missing. What could justice look like? Because if we're talking about rebuilding Syria and also the impacts of that, obviously on Iraq, a post-ISIS, post-Assad region, what would justice look like?
for the Yazidi community.
Yeah.
I think we've missed the opportunity for justice. The fact that it's been over 10 years and there's been so few ISIS fighters tried, and they've only been tried in Europe and just a handful. And so it's too bad the international community didn't immediately put together tribunals and try these fighters for the horrific crimes they committed against the Yazidi community, the Christian community, and others. Because these crimes, for them to have gone unpunished, has sent a message of impunity to the rest of the world, that crimes through
Mm.
terrorism just get forgotten. And where had the international community taken a stand right then, it could have sent a different message to these communities. But there still is time. There still is evidence collected against a lot of these fighters. Now they're imprisoned in Iraq. So hopefully, at some point in time, they can be tried, not for terrorism and then a lot of them given crimes where they're like say executed, but an actual trial for the crimes against particular Yazidi women and Christians and others, because the evidence has been collected for a lot of them. In fact, I think that probably, I don't know how many cases, but I know of several of myself that are ready for trial, but they just need a setting to be able to do it.
And, many people, or the majority of people around the world, when we talk of ISIS, will know that ISIS it was and still is an
Mhm.
evil force. But beyond ISIS as an organizational force, as an organized, there's also many groups in the region still that hold, the same mindset or the same ideology as ISIS. How concerned are you about the ISIS, quote unquote, ISIS mindset in other groups, including, the HTS that now leads Syria?
Well, I think the crimes we've seen by the members of the security forces that hold that ideology against the religious minorities shows us that it's a real problem in Syria. And unfortunately, it's empowered others to join with them. So we saw that when they did the general mobilization against the Alawites, against the Druze, where it wasn't just the security forces, but others joined in with these crimes against those communities as well. And then, of course, the horrific crimes just this last week going into the Northeast against the Kurdish community that we saw. And I want to say on videos that they posted to social media. So it's not that these are accusations. I think they showed a video during the hearing before Congress of Kurdish women fighters being executed. So, this is happening, and so the question is, how do we move against this extremist ideology in the Middle East and Iraq and Syria, and particularly Syria right now, as we're looking at this. And, you can't beat this ideology with weapons. And I think that that's been one of the mistakes that people have by following the fight against ISIS is how do we militarily defeat them? But I think what we saw in the Northeast by building inclusive governance, that changed the way people look at one another. And I've talked to more families and more individuals that told me the story of the governance in Northeast Syria, where with the communes where they bring together 120 families, about it's different in each community, and then they kind of meet together in a multi-faith way and form all these committees and have co-chairs and vice co-chairs that are a man and a woman with different ethnicities and religions, and then they solve their own community's problems. And so that kind of governance where you're bringing together all the different religious and ethnicities in that community and they're sitting together and solving their own problems because they have the space to be able to politically fight almost. They don't fight physically because they're able to sit at a table and argue about their political views and make decisions together. That kind of environment is what has transformed the communities in the Northeast to change the way they see one another, where they weren't seeing their own children in that setting develop those extremist views. And of course, ISIS has continued to be a threat in the Northeast. But in these communities, people have told me themselves how they've seen their own family members that once looked at each other differently now accept one another in a different way. It's really about that human dignity of one another, being able to still be very religious and embrace your own religious community, your own religious beliefs, but also accept the human dignity of your neighbor that has different religious beliefs. And that's really that mindset that we work towards in religious freedom. It's not about becoming more secular. It's about just accepting other people's views and looking at them with the same human dignity that you have. And it's contagious when people set up societies like that. Once people change their minds, it does make a big impact in the way that they're able to live together.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean it is very promising, even just hearing that. I want to ask you a two-part question. Ba when we talk about, kind of acceptance and inclusion, one of the points and arguments that some Syrians have made, both Arab and other Syrians, that Ahmed al-Sharaa sought to gain international or external legitimacy before internal legitimacy, and he kind of prioritized that. Do you think the
Mhm.
international communities rush to, effectively legitimize both Ahmed al-Sharaa as an individual, so as a personality, but also the interim governments? Do you think it's hindered efforts for accountability regarding some of the actions that you've mentioned, but also accountability and the encouragement for some of the inclusion that you've mentioned? And do you think, therefore, the hesitation that both particularly the US, but the international community have had to politically recognize the autonomous administration of Northeast Syria kind of contributed to what we're seeing or some of the risks we're seeing today? I guess to put it in one question, it would be that should the international community, if they were going to legitimize or accept the interim president, should they have also simultaneously politically recognized the autonomous administration too?
Absolutely. It would have made sense for the international community to acknowledge what the Northeast had built. And people misunderstand. They never called for independence in the Northeast, and they've always planned to integrate into a future Syria. So they never had ministries; they had offices. The Office of Foreign, the Foreign Office, not the Foreign Ministry. And so this idea that somehow they weren't Syrians, that they wanted to be part of a different, a Kurdish country, was actually not the case. They've always wanted to be a part of Syria. And I obviously I think Turkey played a big role in this. The U.S. constantly not wanting to offend Turkey, and Turkey was so against the leaders in Northeast Syria, against the Kurdish movement in general. And of course, the PKK played a huge part in that. And I wanted to say that, that is uh, it's really the problem that Erdogan has had with his own Kurds in Turkey have been the reason that he's been against the Kurds in Northeast Syria, because there's never been cross-border attacks against Turkey from Northeast Syria, and it's been well documented, except just in self-defense. So for him to point there and say they're dangerous when he has so many Kurds in his own country, clearly, the Kurdish Turkish peace process is so important. But I think that the U.S. did miss an opportunity with al-Sharaa. Even some of his own advisors have said to me, they need pressure to counter the Islamist base, and the international community should be providing that pressure by giving him rules like we will support you if, and then do these things. I think it's fair. The U.S. does this all the time. Look at all the interactions President Trump has had with so many countries where he's been, I want this, or just, we won't support you. It's We have the right, if we're going to support a country, to have guidelines, and one of them is human rights and how they treat people in their own country. And so, had that been a part of legitimizing al-Sharaa, it would have been easier for him to incorporate these things into his government. Now he's in this position where he has to go back and try to do it, and it's very difficult with some of the empowered Islamists now in his country that don't want that. So that's why pressure is so important. So it's kind of like, when we're pressuring the administration in the United States. I was at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and we blast reports, to the administration on a religious freedom issue, and people would be all stunned, like, I can't believe you guys were so tough. And they didn't understand that the administration wanted us to do that because it provides cover for them to be able to go back to that country and saying we're getting a lot of heat over this issue. And so it's that kind of pressure, not necessarily take down the government, destroy the government, but give the government cover to be able to do the things they need to do to be successful. That's the kind of pressure that I want to see on this government, and that's the kind of pressure the U.S. international community could still do. They may have missed an opportunity to do it sooner, but this would actually help al-Sharaa to build legitimacy with his own people. And at this point in time, that is the most important thing for him. And so it would be a win for him to be able to build this more inclusive government. And in the long term, religious minorities and the majority could have a more peaceful, prosperous country.
Yeah, and I mean, on that note, in terms of opportunities, there's quite a contradiction that's been emerging. There's been demands, and this has been in the agreement made between the Syrian Democratic Forces and the interim government on the 30th of January, that demands that non-Syrian Kurds must leave Syria. I mean, there's a bit of a double contradiction here, actually. One, when many Syrians for, decades and decades were denied citizenship then and not considered Syrian for so long, now are somehow considered Syrian. But also, there's thousands of foreign fighters still within the ranks of the interim government's forces, including Chechens and others. They continue to serve in what has now become the formal army of the Syrian state. As someone who's advocated, and as we've spoken about it, for inclusive governance, how do you see this contradiction? If non-Syrian Kurds have to leave Syria, should non-Syrian fighters within the formal, the now formal army also leave? And what does this tell us about the new Syrian, the interim government, what they consider legitimate versus illegitimate?
Well, certainly the pushing out of non-Syrian Kurds was a Turkish demand, and both President al-Sharaa and the U.S. Defer to Turkey an awful lot when it comes to Syrian policy. So it is completely inconsistent, considering the fact that the video of the woman, the Kurdish fighter's body who was thrown from the building, that was horrific. I think we've all seen on social media just a few weeks ago. Apparently, that was a fighter from Egypt who committed that crime against her. So they're out there. They're targeting minorities. We've seen so many of the videos that were posted from some of the other areas also showed foreign fighters involved in the violence. So the fact that the foreign fighters are allowed to stay is inconsistent with the request that has been made about the Kurds. And I know that myself, I've been told that some of them even live in Christian communities because they thought it was safer to put them there. And that's just not a safe place to put these sometimes hardened Islamists that came to Syria for an ideological reason to put them in the minority communities is just not a good idea.
And I mean, we have already spoken about this a bit, but how does this connect to the what we've seen in the last, well, more than a year, broader pattern of targeting minorities in, as you've just said that, some of these often hardened jihadi fighters who would have traveled to Syria precisely to fight. How is this connected to the targeting of minorities? And also, what do you think it means for the future of Syria?
It will be very difficult if these forces stay as a part of the Syrian government forces because it will challenge the legitimacy for al-Sharaa because even most Sunni Muslims do not want to see violence against their neighbors. They want a peaceful Syria. And for us to think that lifting the Caesar sanctions was all that they needed to be able to build an economy is a little bit of a mistake because without peace and stability, most investors aren't going to come in and invest. And at this point in time, the economy in Syria is so important for people being able to recover their lives and be able to feed their families and be able to just have a future. And it's urgent. And I understand that's why people rushed to support al-Sharaa because I think they just wanted to help the people of Syria. And we were all excited that Assad was gone. So I mean, I understand that, but at this point in time, with some of these mistakes that are actually hurting the economy, hurting social cohesion in the country, and hurting the ability of Syria to move forward. It's so important that they be dealt with immediately and that the international community push for that in order to give cover to the president to be able to do them.
And I mean, you've referred already quite a few times to the peace process or the process that intends to lead to a peace process in Turkey between the Turkish state and the PKK. How do you think that the kind of the positive development of that process is connected to the future of Syria?
I was hoping that it would just completely remove it would have already happened and it would have completely removed the Kurds as being a target in the Northeast. But that didn't happen. I think they slowed down the process and it was easy for them to continue to point to the Kurds in Northeast Syria somehow being a danger to Turkey, which of course is not the case. And so here we are at a point now where of course, the Kurds in Turkey and Syria would benefit by having peace, and Iraq, I should add, would really benefit by this peace process, and having the PKK lay down all their arms and completely eliminate the organization and be able to come back into civil society and have that amnesty to be able to do that. It would be a huge win for the people of Turkey and a huge win for the people of Iraq and Syria for this to happen. And I know they're not there yet, but I know there's a path and it has made some progress. And so I think again, the international community could pressure Turkey to move faster on this process to help bring peace really for the whole region. I mean, northern Iraq has probably over 100 Turkish installations right now in their fight against the PKK. It's emptied out of Syrian villages. It's been very disruptive for the people in northern Iraq as well. And to have that be able to end so that people can go back to their homeland in those areas, their ancestral homes, would really be a big benefit for all the people in the region. And of course, would help the Kurds in northeast Syria too.
And finally, I want to ask you, the same week that there was a hearing in the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee on the Save the Kurds Act, the Syrian Democratic Forces General Commander Mazloum Abdi and the co-chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Northeast, Ilham Ahmed, are at the Munich Security Conference with with a Syrian government delegation present as well, and it's said that they will meet. Do you think that there's a connection here where the pressures that even if it's too late, that some of the pressures that are coming from particularly the US but also internationally is actually moving things in a positive direction?
Oh, I don't think the pressure's too late. While the Northeast, what they had built has changed. Of course, the Arab areas now are not a part of that process. And now we've only got Hasaka, um, uh, Kamishli, the Jazeera area, and Kobani. There still is this integration deal that is on the table, and they're implementing it as we speak. And part of the integration deal keeps the local governance and the local security that they had, but it also allows the Syrian security forces to come in and do things like to run the airport, to have ID offices, and to have limited amount of control, but then to keep those minority villages with only their local security. So I think at this moment, pressure is super important on the Syrian government to keep that deal and to implement it fairly, because so far we haven't seen them keep any of the deals with the Syrian Democratic Forces. Both the March 10th deal wasn't kept, the April 1st deal to integrate the two neighborhoods in a similar fashion in Aleppo weren't kept. So I do think that the only way this is going to work is if there is pressure on the Syrian government to keep it. And that could be a real win for all of Syria, because it would bring a peace and stability to this region, and also keep these minority communities protected as the Syrian government goes through and hopefully revamps their own military and figures out how to keep some of the more dangerous elements out of their security forces, so that we will not continue to see these types of crimes against minority communities.
Thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts. As always, Nadine, it's really, really a pleasure hearing your thinking. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me. It was great having this conversation.
Thank you. And that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. Until next time, take care.